It's pantomime season, and all weekend we've been asking, will Boris leave without a deal? Oh yes he will, say the media and the pundits. Oh no he won't, say I. One certainty, Boris, is that behind you is Michel Barnier, carrying a copy of the EU treaty that you signed. Tonight we'll discuss the level playing field. Is that the key? Fishing, does it matter? And Boris Johnson's leadership. Will he emerge in a fortnight's time as Chamberlain or Churchill? This is Farage Live. Yes, good evening. This is Farage Live, broadcasting live from our new studios, and we're out there on Facebook, Twitter, and on YouTube. Yesterday, I put this tweet out. No deal is the only way Johnson can keep his election promises. I don't believe he will do it. This is all a charade. Now, remember where we've been for the last few days. We've had Boris saying that there could be a no-deal outcome. Noel Edmonds would ask, deal or no deal? Boris then said it's very likely that we'll leave with no deal, and everybody swallowed it. The newspapers swallowed it, the pundits swallowed it, everybody was expecting it to be a no deal. The odds in the betting markets changed significantly too. I, got to tell you, I didn't believe a word of it, and here's why. That front page, the Daily Mail on Saturday, fisheries gunboats in the Channel, armed with machine guns, will stop French boats coming into British waters. Well, I mean, the thought that we're going to use machine guns against 30-foot French netters, I thought was absolutely ludicrous, but classic of the kind of thing that the number 10 spin machine would put out into mainstream media. We're fighting hard. We're battling for Britain. And then I saw Boris Johnson yesterday being interviewed on Sky News, saying that no deal was very likely. And I could see the smirk on his face. This is all, in my view, an act, a giant charade. It's to make us think that they're really, really fighting hard to get us a good deal. Well, let's just remind everybody what the history of this has been. After all, that moment at 4:10 in the morning on what was the 24th of June, 2016, it was 4:10. The sun was just coming out over the east of the River Thames. When I said, dare to dream that the dawn is breaking over an independent United Kingdom, little did I think that it would be 4.5 years on, and we still wouldn't quite know the direction in which we're going. From the beginning, from the absolute beginning, the European Union were determined that we would not simply leave. They wanted it to be a very different, new kind of deal. Indeed, just last week, Ursula von der Leyen tweeted ahead of Boris Johnson going over to have dinner with her. That was a bit rich, wasn't it? Serving turbot, caught by a French boat in British waters, but hey, what do they care? And when she said, Boris is coming to discuss the partnership agreement. This is not an FTA. And if Boris Johnson says we want a Canada-style deal, well, why did he make the absolutely fundamental mistake of signing the withdrawal agreement? Remember that? Last October, he came back from Brussels with an oven-ready deal. Well, it wasn't an oven-ready deal. It was a new EU treaty. And within days, Barnier had it leather-bound and was carrying it under his arm through the European Parliament and around all of the other institutions in Brussels. You see, by us signing up to a new treaty, by us making a whole series of commitments in there that didn't get us out of the level playing field, that did not get us back complete control of our fishing waters, and they're just two little examples, basically the EU had us where they wanted us. I've also seen the mood music over the last couple of weeks. Firstly, we've agreed to stay part of the European human rights regime under the European Court of Human Rights. So quite how we're going to be able to deport anybody anywhere when the Human Rights Act stays part of UK law, I don't know. We also saw an answer in the House of Lords a couple of weeks ago saying that we'd stay part of the European arrest warrant, which means that an EU public prosecutor can still insist that British citizens are deported anywhere to the other 27 countries. And then, of course, there was Michael Gove telling us that Northern Ireland now has the best of both worlds, when the fact is that for us to sell goods into Northern Ireland is going to need declarations, is going to need paperwork, and that there will be EU officials making random checks on those goods. So kind of Northern Ireland has been sold out already. I thought those three things were very bad signs over the course of the last couple of weeks. So the idea it's going to be no deal, the idea that Boris is going to tear up an international binding treaty and we're going to be completely free of all EU rules has, in my view, always been for the birds. And Chris on Facebook sent this in earlier today. He said, big mistake not walking away from the deadline yesterday. Folks, if we were going to leave on Australia terms, WTO terms, if we were going to leave with what they call no deal, yesterday was the day that it would have happened. And I absolutely predict that over the course of the next few days, there will be a deal. Oh, and we'll be told it's a fantastic victory, as we always are. You know, when John Major came back from Maastricht, it was game, set and match. And yet, I think we're going to get a Brexit, which really begins to look a little bit like Brexit in name only. I hope I'm wrong, but that is where I think this is going to go. Now, the single most important part of this is the level playing field, the rules around the European single market. And remember, this was developed back in the 1980s. The idea is that everybody within the zone has pretty much the same level of employment regulations, environmental law, and so on and so forth. It's one rule that is made in Brussels and is applied to all 27, well, it was, of course, with us, 28 member states. And it's all about the freedom of movement of goods, capital, service, and labour. It all sounds absolutely wonderful, but the truth of it is, if you make everything the same, you actually stop there being competition. And this was, for me, one of the main reasons that actually got me involved in all of this way back in the early 1990s. And indeed, in 1999, in the European Parliament, I said this about the level playing field.
Most people in the UK thought we joined a free trade area, but this crisis demonstrates it is anything but that. While the UK has obeyed EU law to the letter, other countries are running a cart and horse through the rule book. The level playing field is about as level as the decks of the Titanic after it hit the iceberg.
So there we are. I felt very passionately about the level playing field back in 1999. It always seemed to me that we obeyed all of the rules, and the others, well, they adopted a more, should we say, slightly laissez-faire attitude. And the further south in the European Union you went, the more that was the truth. I think it is a very, very major issue today. Well, joining me, I'm very pleased to say, is Andrew Bridgen, Conservative Member of Parliament for North West Leicestershire. And Andrew, I suppose you've become one of the independent, outspoken backbenchers of our time.
Well, I'm merely representing the views and the best interests, I believe, of my constituents and the country. And it was interesting what you said about the single market. But I think what your followers need to understand is that actually membership of the single market is actually worth less to the UK than any other country who's in it, because the single market only exists for goods, and 70% of our economy is services, which have never been covered by the single market, much to our chagrin. Yeah. We wanted that. So you're in a situation where a fully trained and qualified barber in Germany can't cut hair in France, and a lawyer from London can't go and practice law without requalifying in Spain. So that's why we have a huge trade deficit, because the single market membership actually suits the other countries who sell us their goods and keeps the UK effectively as a captive market for overpriced EU goods.
Now, Andrew, I got one or two questions that have come in for you when people heard that you were coming on Farage Live tonight. I'm going to put this one to you. Andrew asks you, he says, we just need to get on and get out. It's quite clear that an acceptable deal cannot be reached. Yet all we've seen from the Conservative government is more dither and delay. How do you defend Theresa May and Boris Johnson? It's now, I mean, can you understand, Andrew, why after 4.5 years there are millions of Brexit voters and indeed Tory voters who are pretty fed up with this?
And it's been pretty grating on Parliament as well. I'm not going to seek to defend Theresa May's dealings with the European Union and her negotiations, or Sir Ollie Robbins, as he now is. But Boris Johnson and Lord Frost, I mean, they were dealt a bad hand by Theresa May and her negotiators. They got the EU into very bad habits, thinking that we were going to break every deadline for leaving. The 31st of December is set in law, and it will not be changed. We are ending the so-called transition period.
Are you absolutely certain? Because I've heard this before, that, you know, we're leaving on March the 29th. I heard 108 times from Mrs May. Boris told us that we were leaving, of course, in October, and that then slipped through to January.
Yeah, but Nigel, we didn't have a majority in Parliament at that
Fair
time,
point.
and we needed a general election to reset. We have got a majority now, and there's no way. And Parliament is far more Eurosceptic following the 2019 general election than it's ever been before.
So you're saying to
I agree
people,
with you.
you're saying we can trust you, Andrew, are you? You're saying we can trust you on this?
Well, I'm not in a position to make those decisions, but the music coming out of Number 10 this evening, at this moment, is that there has been no breakthrough in the talks with the European Union, just as there hasn't been since Boris gave them the ultimatum several weeks ago that we might as well stop talking because we're not making any progress. For me, the negotiations are rather like a patient who's expired in a hospital bed, surrounded by concerned people, parties. Everyone knows that the patient's expired. He can't be resuscitated, but no one wants to take responsibility for turning off the life support machine. There's going to be a blame game when we come out with no deal. And I think whoever terminates the talks first they're thinking they're going to get most of the blame. That's not the case. The problem is we've wanted a free trade agreement. We joined the European Union for free trade. It was so-called a common market. Who wasn't going to be against that? We've entered into a protection racket, and the EU really don't want us to get out and be a competitor on their doorstep.
But Andrew,
your followers know all of this.
Andrew, if we wanted a free trade agreement, right? If we wanted a Canada-style deal, and let me tell you, I'd be very, very happy with that. Absolutely no question about that. If we wanted a free trade agreement, you tell me this. Why did Boris Johnson, in October last year, go to Brussels and sign a new EU treaty binding in international law, which was anything but a free trade agreement?
You mean the withdrawal agreement?
Yes. It's not a withdrawal agreement. It's a new treaty. You know, it's leather bound in Brussels. They're very, very proud of it.
Yeah, he got the backstop removed from it, even though the EU said they wouldn't do it. So
the backstop was removed, but we're still stuck in many, many ways, aren't we? And all sorts of provisions.
Yeah, there. I want whatever agreement. I've already said that I want whatever agreement we do. If we do an agreement with the EU, it's got to supersede and replace the withdrawal agreement.
Okay.
And if not, as soon as we come back to Parliament in January, we've got to disentangle ourselves with any elements of the withdrawal agreement that are hanging around. Because the EU have not made it easy for us to leave, have we? You know, the Article 50 process was not to ease your exit from the European Union. The withdrawal agreement, the transition period is anything but a transition period. And here we are, where we always knew we were going to be, negotiating with the EU down to the wire. The wire's been stretched so long, if it snaps back, it's going to have someone's head off.
Debbie on Twitter asks you, Andrew, what compromises on the British side would you swallow, if any?
I would be, well, I've always maintained that the fish issue has been a red herring, if you'll excuse the pun. They know they haven't got any legal right to take our fish after after we've left the European Union, and they will always concede on that, but they'll want us to concede on the very dangerous, innocuously sounding level playing field, which is anything but a level playing field. It's a spider's web we'll never get ourselves out of. So I would, on the basis that our fishing fleet and industry has been so depleted over the years, I would have a staged, allow the EU fishermen to continue to take some fish on a yearly quota basis, reducing over a number of years to allow our fishing industry to grow and fill that gap over a number of years, but not 10 years by any stretch of the imagination. And that's the best deal the EU are going to get on fish.
But to be absolutely clear, Andrew, whatever new agreement, if one is agreed, you want that to replace the withdrawal agreement, the EU treaty, as opposed to being an addendum to it.
Absolutely. It's got to replace, and that's got to be the future relationship, not based on the withdrawal agreement.
Now, no. I'm told that the documents with these new negotiations are over 1,000 pages long.
I heard 600 already.
Okay. Well, let's not quibble. But it's
a lot.
It's a vast text. It's a vast text of legalese. Isn't what's going to happen here that Boris Johnson will come back from Brussels with this document, give it to you, and say we're voting on it in 24 hours' time? Isn't that what's going to happen here? It may.
There are scenarios where you could see that could possibly happen. That will not be acceptable. We always know that every treaty we do agreement with the European Union, the devil's always in the detail. We need the finest legal minds to analyse how all this can be interpreted. I mean, who thought that the EU would seek to interpret the withdrawal agreement, that they would have the ability to carve off Northern Ireland and put tariffs potentially on trade between mainland UK and Northern Ireland? I mean, that was not negotiating in good faith. So,
but Andrew, that is what replaced the backstop. And I'm going to argue with you that far from being a negotiating victory, in some ways, Boris's deal was in some ways even worse than Mrs May's.
Yes, but Boris countered with the internal markets bill, and the only reason we've taken the clauses out, we'll take the clauses out of that prevent the EU interpreting the withdrawal agreement in that way, is because we've got assurances from them they won't do it. That means, and also that those agreements actually prepare the way for no deal, because if there was a deal, we wouldn't need to take those measures because we'd never need them anyway. So this is still preparing the ground for no deal at that stage. I was less discouraged by that, and I'm encouraged that Number 10 are saying this evening there has been no breakthrough, and I don't expect there to be one. We're asking for a trade deal, and the EU want to effectively use this new agreement to take back control of the UK before we've actually regained all our sovereign powers.
So, Andrew, let me, put you on the line here. What do you think is going to happen? We've got 2.5 weeks until this date, and I think you're right. I don't think any form of extension again would be acceptable to voters, and I think Boris's support would fall off a cliff. So I do agree with you on that. But what is going to happen? Are we going to leave with a deal based on the withdrawal agreement, or is it going to be no deal and we walk away?
I think the odds are it would be no deal. I can't see the EU acceding to our demands, and I can't see Prime Minister Boris Johnson or David Frost agreeing to their demands. Right. Wow. We're so far apart, I can't see a deal. But the alternatives are, it's no deal, it's a bad deal, it's an acceptable deal, or a good deal. And we haven't even got time now to look at the detail to find out what sort of deal it would be. So time has basically run out. I think the EU will think that we're going to leave with no deal. They're going to make it really tough for us, and they think we're going to come back with a begging bowl in March, begging to sign the agreement we wouldn't sign now. I think then they've misjudged the British mood and the political impetus. all the way through this Brexit process. We may have been members for 47 years, but I don't think they know the British people very well at all. But I think that's what they think is going to happen.
But they're not dealing with the British people, they're dealing with the British cabinet. And that's my concern. Andrew, we're on the same side on this great Brexit battle. I disagree with you. I think that he is going to sign up to this, but hey, who's to say? Now, one of your colleagues today, Sir Roger Gale, Knight of the Shire from East Kent. Thanet North, and he has said that if Boris Johnson comes back, at the end of this 2 weeks, 2.5 weeks, with no deal, that he ought to resign. What do you think of that?
Well, I mean, Sir Roger has been out of step with the Conservative Party for quite a while on this issue. He is an ardent Europhile. He's one of the few we've got left, and, really... well, I think we should keep him on as a novelty, really. But, I mean, the BBC love him and they'll put him out there. But he in no way represents...
Oh, they have done. He's their hero of the day. Well, I tell you what...
Absolutely. Well, Andrew, but how in touch are the BBC with mainstream public opinion in the UK?
I'll make you a promise, Andrew. If you're right about this, and if Boris does hold his nerve, and if we do leave with no deal, I will personally hail him as a modern-day hero, as I think will much of the country. Andrew, thanks for joining us, and keep battling away, please. Thank you.
Thank you
very much. Well, there's Andrew Bridgen there. He's a lot more bullish than I am about what's going to happen. But this key central question is about the level playing field. It's about making sure that all the rules and regulations that affect all of our businesses in Britain are exactly the same as the rest of the European Union. I mean, if you think about it, it's a real sort of almost communist concept to stop competition on tax and regulation. And Dee on Facebook absolutely hits the nail on the head when she says, my question, Nigel, is why would the political EU ever agree to this? If Britain is a success outside of the EU, others may want to leave. Dee, little story for you. Week after the referendum, I was in Strasbourg, the European Parliament was in session. I was in the coffee bar, well, that's the euphemistic term, I think, for where I was. And there was a very senior German MEP, Hans Olaf Henkel, very charming man, successful industrialist in Germany, and he'd headed up the German equivalent of the CBI. He sat down next to me. He said, Nigel, with Brexit, what are your plans? What is your country going to do? I said, well, Hans, we're going to leave the single market. We're going to leave the level playing field. I said, we're going to cut taxes. We're going to cut regulation. We're going to become a magnet for hundreds of billions of pounds and dollars to come into our country from all over the world. And he looked at me with horror. He said, but you can't do that. If you do that, we would have to leave as well. I said, I know, I agree. The whole thing is a racket. And a few weeks after that, I went into Michel Barnier's office in the European Commission, in the Berlaymont building, and he made it clear that he had one objective with Brexit, and that was to make sure that we remained as closely tied to the EU rulebook as was possible. And even as he said that, his officials were actually drafting what we now know as the withdrawal agreement. Wendy on Facebook asks, the level playing field smacks of still controlling us, which is the reason for us leaving. So, Wendy, one of the negotiations now on the level playing field, and we heard Dominic Raab yesterday saying that the key was the dispute mechanism. As long as the dispute mechanism wasn't adjudged by the ECJ, but if we found some new body with representation from both sides, then suddenly this might be acceptable. That was the Foreign Secretary basically saying we can accept the basis of a level playing field provided it's being adjudged correctly. And today, what Barnier has been saying is whatever agreement they come to, the EU has to have the right to slap tariffs on us if they think that we are becoming too competitive. So in a sense, they want to keep the sword of Damocles hanging over us. I just don't find that to be an acceptable agreement. In all free trade agreements, there are non-regression clauses. There are clauses that stop, the mass dumping of goods, really unfair behaviour. But when it comes to competition, when it comes to having employment regulation, environmental regulation, tax law, that should be up to individual countries to set. And I think the more competitive the environment, ultimately the better deal the consumer gets. And I've always thought that, and I've always felt that. And my last comment I'm going to read out on this is from Actual Patriot on Twitter, who says, my thoughts are we should rejoin the single market ASAP and make the country more prosperous. Well, perhaps Actual Patriot is a front for Lord Adonis, who thinks we should rejoin the single market, rejoin the European Union and join the euro. And my message to people who think that is the war is over. We are not going to be rejoining, end of. Now, Andrew talked there about fisheries, and it's a subject that I've talked about for a long, long time. In fact, shortly after the referendum, I said that fishing would be the absolute acid test of Brexit. The acid test would be, are we going to get back control of our territorial waters? And that doesn't mean chucking all foreign boats out immediately, but it does mean that they would have to fish in those waters on our rules and our terms. Now, you'll hear it day after day. Fisheries don't matter because they just make up 0.1% of the economy. Fisheries don't matter because in direct fishing, it's only employing about 25,000 people. It's only contributing £1.5 billion to the UK economy. And the worry, of course, is that we import so much of what we eat and we export so much of what we catch. Well, why do you think that fisheries is such a small part of our overall national GDP? I'll tell you why. Because it's been destroyed. It's literally the common fisheries policy, the quota system that's been with us now for about 40 years, has literally destroyed the British fishing industry. We only joined the CFP. It was only invented hours before Heath signed the treaty in Brussels. We've been taken for a ride. And in some areas, because of what's called historic access, it really has reached, I think, joke proportions. I mean, currently off the southwest, of the haddock that are caught, 90% are caught by the French, Belgium and Dutch boats, and 10% are caught by the UK fleet. I mean, the whole thing's a joke, and to be honest, those fishermen that are left, most of them are pursuing crab, lobster, whelk, things like this, things that are not on quota. They've virtually given up going to try and catch whitefish, which is why, of course, we import just so much into this country every single year. So, a rejuvenated British fishing sector could be worth 4 or 5 times that number to the UK economy every year. Let me give you one little example. For the last 5 years in a row, there's been a massive run of bluefin tuna in Devon, Cornwall, South Wales, all around the western shores of these islands, even quite a lot up on the western coast of Scotland. When I say big shoals, I mean, hundreds of thousands of mature bluefin, big fish, weighing between 200 pounds and 800 pounds. The Spanish, the French, and the Portuguese are allowed under EU quotas to catch 24,000 tonnes of bluefin tuna a year to sell in the fish markets, and of course in particular to sell to Japan and countries like that that'll pay fortunes for them. Have a guess what the UK fleet quota is for bluefin tuna. How about 0? 0. Just having bluefin tuna quota for the southwest of England could rejuvenate every port in Devon and Cornwall. And that's the point. Here's an asset we're not using and exploiting. So there is a great future for our fishing industry, for our processing industry, for our boat building industry, for all the things that go to support it. But above all of that, there is a symbolism in all of this, because Brexit was about taking back control of our borders, of our territorial limits. That, of course, includes the sea. we saw this story on Saturday about gunboats in the Channel. I never believed it, but funny enough, that is what Norway do. Because Norway have 200 miles of the North Sea, which is their exclusive economic zone. We could have, for Eastern England and Scotland, exactly the same. 200 miles of the North Sea, which is ours. Other boats could fish there, but they pay us to do it, and they do it on our terms. But there's something else here that really matters. And in an age when we're constantly talking about the environment, about how we can improve things, what never gets talked about is what's happening with our fish stocks. Well, do you know what? It really needs to. Because I've seen for the last 4 years in the Eastern Channel, fishing right up to our 6-mile line, the French, Dutch and Belgian fleets, and frankly, fishing in a way that is completely irresponsible. And they're doing it because they're taking the view, well, with Brexit, we might get kicked out. So we will take out of these waters everything we possibly can in this short period of time. And that, frankly, is an environmental disaster. I've seen fish stock decline in the Eastern Channel over the last few years, the likes of which I simply cannot believe. And to add to that, a story that is now beginning to emerge but needs a lot more traction and a lot more coverage, and maybe in the new year, if it's still happening, I'll get back out on the channel and do another Nigel Farage Investigates. But it's this. There are currently 5 giant mega trawlers, effectively factory ships, fishing off the Sussex coast. And we're beginning to see some evidence of this. And the evidence that we're seeing are harbour porpoises and dolphins with terrible slash marks on their body being washed up dead on the beaches of Worthing and Brighton and elsewhere. Some of these fishing methods, have huge bycatch problems, kill an awful lot of marine mammals and other creatures. And some of the big ships can take out up to 250 tonnes a day of mackerel or herring from our waters. And all of this is allowed under EU law. And it's very interesting, going through the messages today, how many of you are beginning to talk about this. Because I think if we talk about fishing in terms of, number one, getting back what is rightfully ours, our territorial waters. Number two, supporting a British industry, getting people back into work, getting fishermen back into, oh, I'm sorry, I've made a mistake. How awful of me. According to the BBC's Today programme, you can't call them fishermen anymore, they are fisher folk. So I'm sorry about that. Sorry, BBC. Roberta's one. She says to me, stop the super trawlers from the 1st of January. If we give them an extra year, there will be no fish left. Roberta, the sheer level of destruction that is going on in the Channel, I won't say in a year's time there'll be no fish left, but this, it seems to me, is now, in the English Channel particularly, an environmental emergency. Peter on Facebook says, I'd rather identify with the fish. They don't care much for EU policies and have more spine and guts than Boris. That's a bit cruel, Peter. That is a bit cruel, but we are going to move on to talk about Boris Johnson and his leadership. And Ray, very perceptively on Facebook, says, or he asks, where is Greta Thunberg when she's needed most to save the planet and our fish? One of the things that I saw over there was that Greenpeace, all of these organisations who should have been screaming blue murder about the common fisheries policy, the damage that it was doing environmentally in Europe, and what was happening off the west coast of Africa and elsewhere under the common fisheries policy, they never seem to criticise too much. Do you know why? Because those very same NGOs received big cheques from the European Commission every year. And that's been really, really clever. And Rob, finally on fisheries, Rob says to me, why do you suddenly care about fisheries? You didn't when you were an MEP and failed to turn up for the meetings. Rob, I've cared about fishing. I'm a keen angler. I'm a keen conservationist. I did join the Fisheries Committee back in 1999. I went to the first half a dozen meetings and I realised we were completely and utterly wasting our time. We were in a minority. We couldn't win a single vote. And I realised then that the argument for me was not to stay inside the European Union to try and reform it. It was to leave and get back what is rightfully ours. Thank you. Now, Boris Johnson. He's an extraordinary figure. He, of course, became Mayor of London, and he was, I think many would think, rather successful at that. He was then, of course, a Foreign Secretary, and many would say he was highly unsuccessful at that. I had never, ever thought of Boris Johnson really as being a Eurosceptic, but he did join the Leave campaign. And all right, he may have joined it at 10 minutes to midnight, but he did join the Leave campaign, and it's very important that he was. But I wonder now, given that the next 2.5 weeks, well, I think in many ways, and yes, I know there's COVID, I know there are many other problems, but it's Brexit, isn't it? It's Brexit that made him the Prime Minister. Without Brexit, he wouldn't have been the Prime Minister. In fact, I might argue, without the Brexit Party, perhaps Theresa May would still be there as Prime Minister. But how is Boris doing on Brexit? And is he going to emerge in 2.5 weeks' time? Is he going to be the new Churchill, which I know he dreams of, or is he actually going to be the new Chamberlain? Well, joining me now to discuss that, somebody who has watched many leaders, many prime ministers over a long political career, is the one and only. She's been an MEP, she's been an MP, appeared on Strictly Come Dancing. She, is, of course, is the one and only Anne Widdecombe. Anne, good evening.
Good evening, Nigel.
Now, I know that you thought that Theresa May was possibly the worst Prime Minister that you'd ever seen in your lifetime. And I think many people would agree with you on that. How is Boris Johnson doing in terms of his leadership, and in particular with these Brexit negotiations, in your view?
Well, as far as the Brexit negotiations go, he's giving a very good impression of the Grand Old Duke of York. He's forever marching us up to the top of the hill. The deadline is looming. We're going to walk away if we haven't got an agreement. The deadline arrives and we're marched down the hill again. And another deadline is set. And then we're marched up the hill again. So I think he's been appallingly irresolute, and that if actually he'd stuck to his first deadline, or even his second, the end of June or the end of July, and had walked away then, I think we would now have a trade deal, because the EU would have realised that we were a sovereign country, that we didn't have to hang around, that we really could just go on WTO terms. And they need to believe that. I think the whole problem has been, well, it's twofold. One is that the EU just haven't got it, that we're a sovereign country. They think we're a semi-detached member. That has been the main problem.
And Anne, he is somebody, though, who gets away with it, isn't he? I mean, he's somebody who says one thing, which it turns out later was completely untrue, and yet the British public do seem to be remarkably forgiving of Boris's sins.
Well, they are. And you see exactly the same phenomenon in the way that he's handled COVID, which has been equally uphills and downhills and changing his mind every 5 minutes, and complete muddle. And yet people do forgive him. Now, I think part of that is due to his opposition being so appallingly weak. I mean, if people think that Boris is weak, well, Keir Starmer is hardly there at all, making no impact at all. Part of it is that, but the other part of it is that people desperately want to believe in Boris. They think he's the real thing. He's very different from previous prime ministers. They want to believe in Boris. Now, I used to believe in Boris, or at least semi-believed in Boris, and I really hoped that he would see this through when he got his majority of 80. After all, he's got no excuse not to see it through.
But Anne, the Sunday papers yesterday were telling us that he's going to leave with no deal.
Yeah, well, he was. That was what he was briefing. And he's still talking about no deal. But if he actually believes that, Nigel, if he really believes that he's going to leave with no deal, well, you know, what are we waiting for? He can give British business that certainty now. Instead of which he's just talking about it. Well, no wonder the EU don't believe him.
So why would they? So you think, as I do, that we're going to leave on the basis of the new EU treaty, the withdrawal agreement that was signed up last year?
Yes, and I think we'll leave with a massively fudged trade deal, whereby we do actually grant them rights to determine our laws, which will be the worst of all scenarios. We do grant them extended rights to our fishing. I can see it all. I can see it all, because if he wasn't going to do that...
Now, you come out, of course, originally from one of the great seafaring ports of this country and somewhere that used to have a very significant fishing fleet. How do you think, if the expectations of, and it's not just the fishermen, is it? It's the coastal communities that we should be talking about here. How do you think they're going to react if they discover that actually we're not really taking back control of our waters properly for maybe 5 or 10 years?
Oh, I think they will react with fury and with despair. But the big question mark is that going to do them any good once he's signed away those very precious rights? And once he's signed away their future, is being angry, is being despairing going to do any good? He's got to be stopped before he does it. And therefore, it is crucial that just in these next couple of weeks now, in this final countdown, beyond which there can be no extension of the deadline, it's crucial now in these final days that we all make it very clear to Boris, and particularly those directly affected like the fishermen, make it very clear to Boris that they will never support him or his party again if he betrays them.
Couldn't be clearer. Anne Widdecombe, thank you very much indeed. Well, Anne never minces her words, does he? You always know what Anne thinks, and that was pretty clear. Lynn on Facebook responds to me and says, I'm angry about the negative statements made regarding Boris. He has had to deal with flooding, a deadly virus which he caught, then became a dad, and not for the first time, and now Brexit. Just shut up and do the right thing and support him. All right, listen. If he does the right thing, I will support him. I'm sure Anne Widdecombe would support him. Doing the right thing is not telling us that he signed an oven-ready deal that is going to be great for this country, when in fact he signed a new EU treaty. And that, of course, is what occurred in the run-up to the general election last year. I knew what was in that treaty. I knew that it meant commitments to regulatory alignment. And so I said to the Conservatives, if you promise in the general election manifesto that we will not have regulatory alignment, I will withdraw candidates against you, against sitting Tory MPs. They made that promise. I kept mine to them, and they won a big majority. So part of Boris's dilemma is this. He's made one set of promises to the European Union in what he signed there last October. He's made another set of promises to the British people in a general election. But the point about democracy is it's the last vote that counts. It's the current government, the current Houses of Parliament that matters. And to me, it's that promise to the British people that really matters. And my concern is, despite sounding tough, despite the so-called gunboat diplomacy, the truth is that it's all a charade. He's going to sign up to a deal which will leave us very tight. I really hope I'm wrong, but every fibre of me senses that I'm not. Jill on Facebook says, or asks, how can we stop Boris from selling us down the river? Sir Roger Gale, my MP, is saying he should resign. Well, Roger Gale, of course, is saying that no deal is why he should resign. If he came back from with a no deal, I think he'd be a hero. Amanda is sceptical on Facebook. She says, I hope a sellout is not the case. If so, Boris is finished and Gove is waiting in the wings. Michael Gove, who did the deal on Northern Ireland and tried to tell us the whole thing was absolutely wonderful. Keith asks me, can you name one good thing about Brexit other than tax avoidance for rich people like yourself? Oh, thank you, Keith. You've made my day. Well, I wish I was in that category where tax avoidance would be useful, but I'm afraid I'm not. And the point about Brexit, Keith, is we take back control of our own lives. Whatever you think out there about the vaccine, I'm hoping that it's a way we can actually get back to normal at some point before too long. But whether you're sceptical or not, the fact is we were the first country in the world to go for the vaccine, and the reason is we weren't members of the European Union. We weren't tied to the European Medicines Agency. And Brexit is all about that. It's all about us being in control of our own lives. It doesn't mean that every decision we take will be the right one, but at least they will be our decisions. Well, that's all we have time for today. Don't forget, you can continue this conversation on Twitter and Facebook, and I'm sure that you will. You've been watching Farage Live. Have a great evening. I'll see you again very soon. Goodbye.
We will make America great again.